You, yes, you listening right now, I know exactly why you're here.
You're endlessly curious.
Right. You want to understand the architecture of the big picture, but you're also completely exhausted by the sheer volume of superficial information out there.
It's just noise at this point.
Yeah, it's all noise. You want to cut through that and actually grasp the underlying mechanics of what you're reading. And you want to do it without feeling like you're drowning in a dry academic lecture.
Which is exactly what we're going to do today.
Exactly. We are taking a deep dive into an incredibly dense, genuinely complex text. We're looking at a comprehensive analysis of Islamic eschatology, written by Marcia Hermanson, sourced from Cambridge Collections Online.
And when Hermanson approaches this topic, what's immediately striking is how quickly she moves past the literalism of the end times.
She totally exposes the underlying philosophical framework.
Right, because this isn't just a chronological timeline of an apocalypse. It's an epistemological battleground.
I love that phrase. It's about the ultimate why of existence, embracing how things begin, the overarching meaning of human history, and the precise direction toward which the entirety of creation is heading.
That framing is essential, because to engage with this text seriously, we have to look past the apocalyptic imagery that usually, dominates mainstream discussions of eschatology.
The Hollywood version.
Exactly. Hermanson's analysis fundamentally tests the fragility of our attachment to what we consider phenomenologically real.
Because we go through our daily lives assuming the ground beneath our feet is solid.
Right. That time moves in a predictable, linear fashion. We assume our current physical reality is the ultimate baseline.
But these eschatological doctrines act as a systematic deconstruction of that baseline.
They remind us that the conditions striking us now as unquestionably permanent are, in fact, highly contingent and incredibly fragile.
And what's crucial to establish right from the outset, and Hermanson makes this very clear, is that this text does not present a single monolithic view.
Not at all. There is no central papal-like institution restricting doctrine here.
So we're looking at a highly complex, fiercely debated spectrum of interpretations. We've got Sunni theological schools, Shia perspectives, rigorous philosophical viewpoints, and profound mystical traditions.
It's a massive interpretive diversity.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because reading through this source material, the core tension that seems to anchor the entire text is this historical tightrope walk.
The struggle between revelation and reason.
Yes, it's this agonizing struggle between literal approaches to divine revelation on one side and the interpretive limitations of human reason on the other.
Thinkers in this tradition spent centuries wrestling with how to systematically understand texts that completely confound everyday empirical rationality.
And Hermanson introduces this specific category from the late Kalam manuals, the scholastic theology text called Samiyat.
Samiyat, which basically translates to matters heard.
Or things that are received in faith. Our source explains that unlike debates over metaphysics or the necessity of prophecy, which theologians felt could be argued using logic.
Right, things you could prove.
Yeah, these eschatological teachings are categorized as lying completely outside the reach of rational proof.
They're beyond the event horizon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To use a modern analogy, it's almost like receiving a massive, fundamental software update for a complex operating system.
Okay, like this.
You're handed the terms and conditions, and you have to hit install based entirely on the authority of the developer. Because you simply don't have the administrative privileges or the source code to verify what happens after the system reboots. Human reason cannot peer past the event horizon of the universe's end.
I would push back slightly on the implication that this was viewed as a blind, unthinking surrender, though.
Okay, how so?
What's fascinating here is how the categorization of Samiyat actually reflects a highly sophisticated epistemological boundary.
So it was intentional.
Very intentional. The theologian's task in these late Kalam manuals wasn't to logically deduce the architecture of the afterlife. They recognized the hubris in attempting to measure the infinite with a finite yardstick.
So their task was defensive.
Strictly defensive. It was to protect the scriptural predictions from being casually dismissed or radically misinterpreted by hyper-rationalists.
That makes a lot of sense. And this boundary setting brings us directly to how time itself is structurally conceived in this framework.
Yes. The Islamic concept of time aggressively defies the linear Newtonian progression from point A to point B.
The progression that totally dominates Western post-Enlightenment thought.
Right. Hermanson outlines it as a multi-layered construct. First, you have Azolo.
Azal, which is conceptualized as a pre-time.
a pre-time or an eternal anticipation where the archetypal elements of the future are already established. Then there is la zaman,
which is a realm of complete timelessness.
an absolute beyond time. And finally, abad, which is post-eternity or the unending afterlife.
Grasping this non-linear layered architecture of time is absolutely critical for understanding one of the most profound theological concepts detailed in the text.
The Primordial Covenant.
Yes, the Primordial Covenant fundamentally reorients how we're supposed to view human consciousness and agency. Hermanson points to Quran 7.172, which describes a literal time before time.
In the realm of Azal.
Right. In this state of pre-time, all unborn human souls, every single entity that would ever exist, implicit in the loins of Adam, were gathered together.
Just a vast ocean of unborn consciousness.
And God asked these countless unborn consciousnesses a single defining question. Am I not your Lord?
And the text states that every single soul replied, yes, we testify.
It gives me chills. The theological assertion here is that before physical embodiment, before the universe as a material construct even began to tick forward, human consciousness already possessed a profound, direct, and unmediated interaction with the divine.
It establishes a baseline of spiritual recognition that entirely predates biology.
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of epistemology, the psychological impact of the Primordial Covenant is staggering.
It shifts everything.
It completely shifts the paradigm of what it means to acquire knowledge or seek truth in the material world. If every soul has already testified to the divine reality in pre-time, then the fundamental purpose of life isn't about learning a brand new alien truth.
It's about remembering.
It is entirely about the act of remembering an ancient reality that you already acknowledged. You are essentially trying to recover a lost memory of your own primordial state.
And this brings up a critical distinction in Islamic anthropology that Hermanson details. There is an absolute absence of an original sin or a fall narrative.
That's a huge departure from other traditions.
Huge. Humans are not born carrying a genetic or cosmic guilt that inherently corrupts their nature. Instead, the source notes they're born with a sound, uncorrupted, original disposition.
A concept known as fitra.
Fitra, exactly. Therefore, the revealed law, the Sharia, is not functioning as a mechanism to salvage a fundamentally broken or depraved soul.
It's not a rescue mission from inherent evil.
Right. The revelations, the rituals, the ethical codes, they are all mnemonic devices. They're tools for restoring that pretemporal memory, helping the individual recall that initial yes uttered in the realm of Azal.
So existence isn't a process of fixing a broken machine.
It's a process of waking up a sleeper who has forgotten their own identity.
And that framework ties directly into the concept of the return, or mad. Hermanson's text explores how human life in this lower material world is ultimately viewed as a path of return to that divine source.
But what complicates this beautifully is the duality of how this return is executed.
You have the compulsory return and the voluntary return.
Right. The compulsory return is the unavoidable physical death and bodily resurrection that happens to everyone at the end of the timeline, regardless of their consent.
It's happening whether you want it to or not.
But on the other hand, there's the voluntary return. This pathway is heavily emphasized in the philosophical and Sufi systems outlined in the text. Here, the individual consciously and spiritually participates in this return while they are still physically alive.
They are actively, daily shaping the ontological reality of their own soul through spiritual discipline and remembrance.
Which forces us to ask, what is the actual operating purpose of life while we're navigating this material plane?
And Hermanson provides two beautifully contrasting ethical orientations here.
The first is a strict deontological ethic. It's anchored in Quran 51.56, which states that humans and jinn were created only to worship God.
It's a highly transactional, obedience-based framework. You adhere to the revealed law, you fulfill your obligations, and you are subsequently rewarded in the afterlife.
It's very clear-cut. But then, the text pivots to the deeply mystical perspective of the great Andalusian thinker Ibn Arabi.
The contrast Hermanson highlights there is deeply illuminating because it showcases the vast spectrum of Islamic thought. Ibn Arabi responds to the exact same existential question of human purpose, but he anchors his theology in a famous hadith Qudsi,
where God says, I was a hidden treasure and I wanted to be known, and therefore I created the universes.
Yes. In this framework, the ultimate purpose of human life is not mere transactional obedience. It's gnosis. It's realization.
The human being is the cognitive instrument through which the divine comes to know itself in the mirror of creation.
These two views represent profoundly different gravitational poles. The deontological view fiercely protects divine transcendence. God is wholly other, infinitely above and beyond, and the human role is submission.
Right.
But the gnosis view leans heavily into divine immanence. God is the hidden reality suffusing all creation, yearning to be recognized and experienced by the human heart.
It perfectly illustrates two totally divergent operational mindsets from moving through the world. The deontological approach functions almost like a diligent employee within a vast, strict corporation.
You study the rule book.
You execute your tasks flawlessly, you respect the sheer authority of the hierarchy, and you do it with the expectation of the ultimate pension plan salvation.
A very safe, structured path.
Exactly. But Ibn Arabi's approach is like being an artist or a visionary founder within that same structure. You aren't just memorizing the rules, you're trying to intimately understand the actual soul of the enterprise.
You want to uncover the hidden treasure of why existence even bothers to exist.
You are an active participant in the divine self-disclosure. But regardless of whether a person operates as the strict rule follower or the mystical visionary, they are both currently acting within a physical theater.
A physical theater that is scheduled for a violent demolition.
Precisely. The internal voluntary shaping of the soul is eventually going to be violently interrupted by the external compulsory end of the cosmos.
Which brings us to the mechanics of how this material universe is sustained in the first place, and exactly how it unravels. Hermanson explains that the Quranic conception of creation is twofold.
Right, it's not just a one-and-done event.
No, it is described as an initial instantaneous command, the imperative be, or kun fayakun, that brings reality into existence out of nothingness.
But crucially, it's also described as a continuous ongoing process of divine management.
Known as tadbir.
Tadbir. This is a total rejection of the deist clockmaker God who winds up the universe and steps back to watch it run on autonomous natural laws.
In this theological framework, reality is sustained moment by the divine will. If that continuous sustenance were withdrawn for a microsecond, the universe would instantly blink out of existence.
It's a terrifyingly fragile existence.
Therefore, the eschatological end, the actual end of the world, is not just a natural degradation or a heat death of the universe. It is an active, deliberate overturning of the natural order by the very force that sustains it.
And the textual descriptions of this overturning are incredibly visceral. They're almost terrifying in their cinematic scale. Hermanson points specifically to Surah 81 to illustrate this chaotic unmaking.
The imagery is relentless.
It describes the sun being physically overthrown and darkened, the stars losing their light and scattering, the massive, unshakable mountains being moved and crumbling like dust, the oceans boiling over.
It depicts a complete breakdown of human socioeconomic structures, too. It mentions that pregnant camels, which represented the absolute pinnacle of wealth and survival for the pre-Islamic Arabs, will simply be abandoned as people panic.
But the image that absolutely anchors the moral weight of this cosmic collapse is the sudden mention of the infant girl who was buried alive.
A tragic pre-Islamic practice.
Yes. In the midst of the stars falling and the oceans boiling, the text zeroes in on this murdered child being asked for what sin she was slain. It violently juxtaposes macrocosmic destruction with razor-sharp, unavoidable moral accountability.
You have to consider how this rhetoric landed on the ears of the pre-Islamic Arabs.
It must have been devastating.
Hermanson notes that for them, the predictable constancy of nature was their only real security. They relied on the unmoving stars to navigate featureless, lethal deserts. They relied on the predictable cycles of their livestock for basic survival.
To be suddenly confronted with a theology that says the stars will fall, the mountains will shatter, and all your wealth will be meaningless must have been an ontological shock of the highest order.
It was explicitly designed to be an ontological shock. The rhetoric served to systematically dismantle their entire epistemology, which was based entirely on the permanence of the observable world.
By destroying the reliability of the cosmos in these poetic descriptions, the text forces the listener to search for permanence elsewhere.
Specifically in the moral and divine reality that survives the physical collapse.
And the ultimate subversion of their worldview, as Hermanson emphasizes, was the introduction of the new creation, the Khalq Jadid.
The doctrine of the literal resurrection of the physical body.
Which was perhaps the single hardest concept for the pre-Islamic Arabs to swallow. They viewed death as a final material dissolution. The idea that decomposed bones and scattered dust would be reconstituted into a living, breathing human being was met with intense incredulity.
The text highlights how the Quran repeatedly and forcefully asserts the reality of bodily resurrection, turning it into a fundamental litmus test for faith.
But we shouldn't assume this incredulity simply vanished once the Islamic Empire was established.
Not at all. The exact mechanics of how a body is resurrected remained a fiercely contested philosophical battleground for centuries.
Thinkers like the brilliant polymath Avicenna approached the doctrine from a radically different angle, attempting to synthesize it with Neoplatonic philosophy.
Avicenna's approach is a perfect example of that constant tension between revelation and reason. Hermanson notes that Avicenna focused on Quranic verses like, "O contented soul, return to your Lord, pleased and pleasing."
He utilized this to argue that the eschatological return isn't necessarily a crude, physical reassembly of biological tissue and bone.
Instead, he conceptualized resurrection as the soul's return to its archetypal, pure source of essential reality. He prioritized the intellectual and spiritual survival of the individual over the material.
But this intense debate over the nature of the ultimate resurrection naturally forces us to look at the waiting period. What exactly happens to the human consciousness in the vast stretch of time between the moment of individual physical death and this final cosmic trumpet blast?
Hermanson introduces us to the concept of the barzakh, the intermediary state.
And the theological wars fought over what actually occurs in this waiting room of the grave were incredibly bitter.
The debate over the barzakh is a masterclass in how different theological camps negotiated the literalism of Scripture.
According to tradition, once a person dies, their soul enters this intermediary state and is immediately subjected to an examination by angels in the grave.
They are interrogated regarding their faith and their deeds, and the outcome of this interrogation results in an experience that anticipates their ultimate eternal destiny.
Often described as either a widening, luminous comfort or a crushing, painful constriction.
Right. And the Asherites and the Maturidites, the major schools of Sunni orthodoxy, demanded strict literal belief in these punishments of the grave.
They argue that God's power is absolute. If the texts say the dead experience physical pain or pleasure in the grave, then it is an undeniable reality.
Regardless of whether human senses can observe a decomposing corpse feeling it.
But on the opposing flank, you had the Mutazilites and the Kharijites. The Mutazilites were the great champions of rational theology, and they often outright rejected the idea of literal physical punishments in the grave.
Their logic was straightforward. A lifeless, decomposing biological form lacks the sensory apparatus to feel pain. To claim otherwise was, to them, an affront to reason.
Meanwhile, the philosophers and mystics, following lines of thought similar to Avicenna, offered a highly sophisticated synthesis.
They suggested that in the barzakh, the soul does not inhabit a dense physical body, nor is it purely abstract. Instead, it exists in an imaginal form within the alam al-mithal, the imaginal world.
In this state, the rewards or punishments are intensely experienced through the imaginative faculty.
It is analogous to the profound, sometimes terrifyingly real physiological responses we have during a deeply vivid dream, even while our physical bodies lie completely paralyzed in bed.
That analogy of the dream state is actually central to how the text describes the phenomenological experience of time and reality across these different planes.
Hermanson cites a philosophical view suggesting that our present waking life in this dense physical world is actually akin to a dream when compared to the heightened reality of the barzakh.
And then the barzakh itself, despite feeling intensely real to the soul experiencing it, is merely like a deep sleep from which the final ultimate resurrection will eventually awaken you.
It's a stunning Russian nesting doll of realities.
It really is. You are walking around right now completely convinced of your wakefulness, but eschatologically speaking, you're just navigating the outermost, dullest layer of the dream.
And you remain in that intermediate sleep of the barzakh until the entire system is jolted awake by an event that shatters all illusions.
Hermanson's text details that the catalyst for this ultimate awakening is the sounding of the trumpet.
Specifically, the eschatological timeline mapped out in the text relies on two distinct trumpet blasts to initiate the end times.
The first blast is conceptualized not just as a sound, but as a catastrophic cosmic wind.
A wind that extinguishes all remaining biological life and systematically unweaves the physical universe. It is the definitive closure of the current epoch.
Following a period of absolute silence and non-existence, the second trumpet blast resounds.
This is the catalyst for the Qiyamah, the rising up or the universal resurrection of the dead.
But to truly understand the sheer gravity of this moment, we have to contextualize why humanity is being summoned for judgment in the first place.
And Hermanson anchors this in a profound, almost tragic Quranic concept known as the trust, or the amana.
According to Quran 33.72, before the dawn of human history, God offered this immense, undefined cosmic trust to the heavens, to the earth, and to the great mountains.
But these massive, enduring creations all refused to bear it. They shrank away, terrified of the catastrophic responsibility and the potential for failure it entailed.
Yet the human being, fragile, temporal, and flawed, stepped forward and accepted the trust.
The verse concludes with a devastating psychological assessment, describing the human being as oppressive and ignorant for having the sheer hubris to take on such an overwhelming burden.
That is one of the most sobering concepts in the entire text. You have the mountains, these symbols of absolute permanence and strength, looking at the fine print of moral agency and free will and saying, absolutely not, the margin of error is too high.
But we humans, in our profound ignorance of the stakes, confidently volunteered.
And because we arrogantly assume that moral agency, we are now bound by the ultimate accountability. That accountability is realized at the assembly, the Hashiray.
Hermanson describes this as the terrifying moment post-resurrection where every man and woman who has ever lived is gathered together on an immense, brutally featureless plain.
There are no mountains to hide behind, no societal structures to shelter in, just millions of naked souls exposed to the absolute reality of divine justice.
If we connect this cosmic eschatological architecture to the lived, physical rituals of Islam, Hermanson draws a brilliant and necessary parallel between this terrifying assembly and the earthly Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca.
When you examine the phenomenology of the Hajj, it is clearly designed to induce a state of profound, controlled disorientation.
You have millions of people packed together in massive, overwhelming crowds. The heat is oppressive. The sheer scale of humanity is dizzying.
Most importantly, every male pilgrim is required to strip off their tailored clothes, the markers of their wealth, their social class, their national origin, and wrap themselves in the ihram, the two seamless white garments.
These garments are intentionally identical to the simple shrouds in which the dead are buried.
The Hajj, therefore, is not merely a geographic journey. It is a meticulously choreographed physical rehearsal for Judgment Day.
It systematically strips away your earthly ego and status, reducing you to a vulnerable, anonymous soul standing shoulder to shoulder with humanity before the divine. It simulates the exact psychological terror and awe of the final assembly.
Viewing the Hajj as a literal simulation of the apocalypse adds such incredible weight to the ritual. You are essentially practicing your own death and resurrection.
Now, once humanity is gathered on that featureless plane of the assembly, the precise mechanics of the judgment commence.
And Hermanson's text outlines a very specific, almost bureaucratic anatomy to this reckoning.
It begins with the distribution of the records.
Every individual is handed a book detailing their life's actions. It's received either in the right hand, signaling salvation, or the left hand, signaling doom.
But it goes beyond just reading a text. The Quran states that a person's very own limbs, their hands, their feet, their skin, will betray them.
They miraculously speak up to testify against the individual regarding the sins they committed.
Then, the process moves to the scales, the mizan, where the metaphysical weight of one's deeds is translated into physical mass and weighed for perfect justice.
Following this is the traverse of the Sirat. This is described as a bridge stretched directly over the abyss of hellfire.
Famously depicted in later traditions as being thinner than a hair and sharper than a sword.
The guilty lose their footing and plunge into the fire, while the righteous pass over safely, some at the speed of light, to reach the heavenly pool, the hod of the prophet, where they are purified.
But within all these terrifying mechanics, the concept that I find most philosophically gripping is the nature of embodied punishment.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the concept of embodied sin is a fascinating intersection of theology and psychology.
The prophetic traditions Hermanson cites indicate that the punishments endured in the afterlife are not arbitrary, external tortures designed by a wrathful deity.
Right, the punishment is intrinsically tied to the exact nature of the transgression.
The text highlights a vivid example: the sin of avarice, or extreme hoarding greed. The traditions state that a miser's hoarded wealth will literally transform into a massive, venomous snake that coils tightly around their neck, biting them relentlessly.
Exactly. It isn't a scenario where God observes a person being greedy, checks a ledger, and decides, I'm going to throw a snake at them as a penalty.
The snake is the greed.
The psychological constriction, the toxic hoarding, the suffocating selfishness that the miser cultivated internally during their life has simply been translated into its true ontological form in the afterlife.
The inner state becomes the outer reality.
Your sin becomes your localized environment. It is an inescapable, perfectly calibrated form of poetic justice.
But Hermanson's text makes it clear that this ultimate individual judgment is not the only eschatological horizon.
History itself, on a macro level, has a determined destination.
Nations and societies are judged within the flow of historical time, leading to a grand, tumultuous finale for the human story right here on Earth, long before that first trumpet ever blows.
And this necessitates a deep dive into the messianic expectations, the arrival of the Antichrist, and the apocalyptic signs.
This is where the eschatological narrative shifts from cosmic physics to geopolitics and human leadership. Central to this earthly finale is the figure of the Mahdi, which translates to the rightly guided one.
The anticipation of a charismatic, divinely appointed leader who emerges at the end of time to eradicate tyranny and fill the earth with justice is a motif shared across many religious traditions.
However, as Hermanson meticulously documents, we must impartially recognize the profound sectarian divergence regarding the identity and function of the Mahdi within Islam.
We are strictly relying on the source's historical mapping of theology here. Let's look at the broad Sunni tradition first.
In the Sunni view, the concept of the Mahdi has generally remained somewhat fluid. It hasn't traditionally been the focal point of constant, everyday millenarian expectation.
Instead, the Mahdi functions as a latent theological archetype that is usually invoked during periods of intense historical trauma or political crisis.
When a society feels overwhelmed by corruption or foreign domination, a figure may arise or be proclaimed by followers as the Mahdi to mobilize resistance.
Hermanson cites the famous historical example of Muhammad Ahmad in the Sudan in 1885, who declared himself the Mahdi to lead a massive anti-colonial revolt against British and Egyptian forces.
So for Sunnis, the Mahdi is a future yet-to-be-born leader who will navigate the community through its darkest hour.
But when we shift to the Twelver Shia perspective, the Mahdi is not an abstract future possibility. He is a highly specific, continuous reality.
In Twelver Shia theology, the Mahdi is definitively identified as the 12th Imam in the line of succession from the Prophet Muhammad.
Hermanson notes the critical historical turning point here. This 12th Imam did not die, but rather went into a state of occultation or gaiba in the year 939 CE.
He was hidden by God from the eyes of humanity. Therefore, the Twelver Shia community is not waiting for a new leader to be born. They are waiting for the reemergence of this specific hidden Imam.
He is the Al-Qaim, the one who will eventually rise up to reclaim his rightful authority and establish perfect justice.
The socio-political implications of these divergent theologies cannot be overstated. Hermanson brilliantly analyzes how this belief shaped centuries of Shia history.
Because the Shia community frequently existed as a marginalized, heavily persecuted minority under various Sunni caliphates.
The theological certainty of a specific, divinely protected deliverer who would eventually return to vindicate their suffering became deeply resonant.
However, this intense eschatological hope created a paradox of political action.
Pre-modern Shiite political theory generally posited that in the absence of the infallible 12th Imam, no worldly government could ever claim absolute divine legitimacy.
Consequently, the fervent wait for the Mahdi largely translated into a stance of political quietism for the bulk of Shia history.
The prevailing attitude was one of enduring the current, inherently flawed political realities, avoiding disastrous rebellions, and patiently awaiting the true ruler's return.
It is a striking example of how a belief in the end of the world can fundamentally dictate the political strategy of the present. It's a brilliant paradox. The ultimate revolutionary expectation breeds centuries of practical political patience.
Alongside the Mahdi, Hermanson also introduces a related, though less apocalyptic concept known as centennialism.
This is derived from a prophetic tradition suggesting that God will send a renewer, or mujaddid, to the Muslim community at the turn of every single century to restore the pure practice of the faith.
But unlike the Mahdi, who is a military and political savior, these renewers are typically recognized in hindsight as brilliant scholars or spiritual reformers, figures like al-Ghazali.
They revitalize intellectual life, but don't usually trigger mass apocalyptic mobilization.
However, whether it is a scholarly renewer or the militant Mahdi, the forces of good are going to face unprecedented opposition, because the text explicitly outlines the emergence of the ultimate antagonist, the Dajjal.
The Dajjal operates as the supreme figure of eschatological terror and deception, translating essentially to the false messiah or the great deceiver.
The Dajjal is prophesied to emerge, leading the consolidated forces of evil. The traditions characterize him heavily through physical abnormalities,
Most notably that he is one-eyed.
which many later commentators have interpreted metaphorically as possessing a worldly, materialistic vision completely devoid of spiritual depth.
He represents the ultimate inversion of truth, performing false miracles to lead the masses astray.
And the emergence of the Dajjal is not an isolated event. It is firmly embedded within a highly structured sequence of catastrophes.
Hermanson's text details the prophetic traditions that outline the 10 signs of the hour. It's a specific checklist of cosmic and earthly events that must transpire before the final trumpet is blown.
Let's examine that list of the 10 signs because it reads like a script for the ultimate cosmic disaster movie.
The sequence includes the sun rising from the west, completely upending the laws of orbital mechanics, the sudden descent of a thick, suffocating smoke, the emergence of the Dajjal to spread global deception.
The appearance of a mysterious beast of the earth.
Then, 3 massive catastrophic land collapses or eclipses, one in the east, one in the west, and one in the Arabian Peninsula.
Following this is the miraculous descent of Jesus.
Then, the breaching of the barrier holding back Gog and Magog, Yajuj and Majuj, who swarm the earth in unimaginable numbers.
And finally, a massive, unquenchable fire that erupts from the lower part of Aden in Yemen, literally driving the remnants of humanity toward the final gathering place.
It is a relentless, overwhelming cascade of chaos.
While the sheer scale of the imagery is captivating, what is paramount for our analytical deep dive is how Hermanson contextualizes the origin and function of these apocalyptic narratives.
She points out that much of this specific eschatological material is found within the genre of fitan literature.
Fitan translates to trials, tribulations, or civil wars.
In the first few centuries of Islamic history, the nascent Muslim community was subjected to immense, world-shattering political and social turbulence.
They were watching the colossal, seemingly invincible Roman and Persian empires clash and crumble around them.
More traumatizing were the brutal internal civil wars, the struggles for leadership that fractured the early community and shattered the ideal of unified religious brotherhood.
Hermanson argues that the early Muslims, trying to intellectually process these massive geopolitical traumas, utilized eschatological narratives as a coping mechanism.
They borrowed heavily from shared ancient Near Eastern apocalyptic motifs and mapped their very real immediate anxieties onto the canvas of the end times.
The literature of the apocalypse became a theological pressure valve for processing historical terror.
So they were essentially taking the chaos of an assassination or a civil war in the 8th century and writing it into the script of the cosmos to give it ultimate meaning.
Exactly.
But amidst all the beasts, the smoke, and the geopolitical anxieties, the sign that consistently surprises people the most is the return of Jesus.
In Islamic eschatology, Jesus is not a marginal figure. He plays a profoundly central, heroic role at the very climax of human history.
According to the text Hermanson analyzes, Jesus physically descends from the heavens, specifically to assist the Mahdi in turning the tide against the forces of evil.
And it was Jesus, not the Mahdi, who is prophesied to physically confront and slay the Dajjal.
However, Hermanson is exceptionally careful to delineate the severe theological boundaries surrounding this event. The return of Jesus in the Islamic framework is absolutely not viewed as a vindication of Christian or Jewish theological claims that Islam superseded.
I'm glad you highlighted that, because the theological mechanics here are precise and unyielding. Hermanson explains that because Islamic anthropology inherently rejects the concept of original sin, as we discussed with the Fitra, the entire theological edifice of a necessary divine redemption or a blood atonement is rendered moot.
It is considered neither necessary for salvation nor logically possible.
Consequently, the Islamic tradition vehemently rejects the historical crucifixion of Jesus, arguing that a true prophet and Messiah would not be subjected to such an ignominious death by his opponents.
When Jesus returns, the Hadith literature explicitly identifies him returning not as a bringer of a new covenant or divine savior, but as a Muslim who rigorously follows the established law of the Quran.
His second coming is interpreted as the ultimate fulfillment of Islam's view of a continuous, unified trajectory of monotheism.
And to decisively underscore his mortal humanity and his status as simply one esteemed prophet among many, Hermanson notes that after Jesus establishes peace and kills the Dajjal, he will live out his remaining years, marry, and eventually die of natural causes before the final judgment day.
This ensures adherence to the absolute Quranic principle that every soul shall taste death.
It brilliantly diffuses the Christian theological claims while still honoring Jesus' immense prophetic status. He's essentially completing his natural human life cycle, which was simply paused and deferred to the end of time.
But as you can imagine, attempting to reconcile all of these incredibly specific, narrative-heavy signs, from the physics of the sun rising in the west to the exact legal status of Jesus upon his return, sparked massive, intellectually violent debates among early Muslim scholars.
They were tasked with rationalizing prophecies that fundamentally defy empirical observation.
And that brings us to the core of Hermanson's analysis, where we explore the great debates, the clash between reason and revelation.
Because the theologians didn't just passively transcribe these prophecies, they engaged in fierce, centuries-long battles over their implications.
One of the most explosive battlegrounds was the doctrine of intercession, or shafa.
The central question was, when you are standing on that featureless plane of judgment, can anyone advocate for you, or are you entirely alone with your deeds?
The debate over intercession cuts to the very heart of the tension between absolute divine sovereignty and the desperate human need for mercy.
The Quran contains verses that seem entirely prohibitive, stating categorically that no soul shall bear the burden of another, which implies a system of strict, individualized justice where no one can save you from your own actions.
However, other verses introduce a caveat, suggesting intercession might occur, but only by his permission.
This textual ambiguity fractured the theological landscape. The Mutazilites, who were the uncompromising champions of rational theology, alongside later revivalist movements like the Wahhabis and certain Islamic modernists, argued for a strict, unyielding to intercession.
Their philosophical argument was rooted in the absolute unity and perfect justice of God. If God has perfectly weighed a person's deeds and determined they deserve punishment, then a prophet or a saint begging God to change his mind implies that either God's initial judgment was flawed or that God can be emotionally swayed.
Both of which compromise his absolute perfection.
On the opposing side, the mainstream Sunni orthodoxy and the mystical Sufi traditions argued strongly, yes.
They relied heavily on vast collections of hadith that depicted the Prophet Muhammad, and even highly elevated saints or awliya, actively pleading for the salvation of major sinners within their community.
Acting as necessary mediators between the terrified masses and the sheer awe of the divine judge.
You can entirely sympathize with the psychological friction happening here. The architecture of the religion demands total, uncompromising submission to God's omnipotence and perfect justice. The Mutazilites are trying to protect the logical integrity of God.
But on the human level, the psychology of facing absolute judgment is terrifying. You want a lawyer. You desperately want someone with influence in your corner on Judgment Day.
As Hermanson's analysis points out, the purely rational, mathematically precise view of the Mutazilites risked reducing God to a cold, calculating, merciless automaton. It stripped the warmth, the relationship, and the dynamic of grace out of the divine encounter.
And this exact same ideological fault line fueled another massive, highly technical debate that Hermanson covers, known as the promise and the threat, or all wides.
The doctrine of the promise and the threat is essentially the Mutazilite attempt to lock God into a rational contract.
They asserted that because God is fundamentally and perfectly just, and because God does not break his word, an individual's eternal fate can be logically, rationally ascertained right here on earth.
It is based entirely on God's explicit promise to reward the obedient and his explicit threat to punish the transgressor.
In their view, if you commit a major sin and die without repenting, God is logically bound by his own threat to send you to hell. To do otherwise would be a violation of his own stated justice. It is a strict, inescapable calculus.
But the Asherites and the Hanbalites, who ultimately shaped mainstream Sunni orthodoxy, fiercely attacked this position.
They argued that trying to bind God to a rational calculus dangerously limits God's sovereign, absolute will. It elevates a human conception of logical justice above God's unfettered freedom.
They countered by insisting that God's mercy intrinsically overrides and outweighs his wrath. God can choose to completely forgive a massive sinner for reasons we cannot comprehend, simply because he is sovereign.
Therefore, the Asherites concluded that a believer can never rest in absolute certainty of salvation. They must live out their lives suspended in a dynamic psychological state that perfectly balances profound hope in God's mercy with a healthy fear of his justice.
I've always thought of the promise and threat debate like a massive argument over how a university professor grades a final exam.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
The Mutazilite rationalist view is saying, look, I read the syllabus. The syllabus is a binding contract. It says if I score a 90, I get an A, and if I score a 50, I fail. God promised the A, so I rationally know my exact standing.
But the Asherite view is countering. Yes, the professor wrote the syllabus, but the professor is infinitely sovereign over the classroom. Maybe you scored a 40, but the professor has the absolute, unrestrained right to grade on a massive curve and pass you out of pure, unaccountable mercy. Or maybe you scored a 95, but you were deeply arrogant, and the professor decides to fail you anyway.
You simply cannot put God in a logical box or force him to act according to a human spreadsheet.
And speaking of the impossibility of defining God by human metrics, Hermanson introduces one more monumental debate that pushed the limits of philosophy: the beatific vision, or ruya.
The question here is deceptively simple but philosophically explosive. Will the believers physically see God in paradise?
The debate over the beatific vision highlights the sheer difficulty of expressing the infinite using finite language. The Asherites looked at specific Hadith traditions, which explicitly stated that believers in paradise would gaze upon their Lord as clearly as one sees the full moon.
Committed to defending the literal truth of the traditions, they argued, yes, believers will undeniably see God.
However, they immediately hit a philosophical wall. God is immaterial. He does not possess a physical body, shape, or form. How do you see something that has no physical dimension?
The Asherites solved this by invoking the concept of bila kayf, which translates to without asking how.
They asserted the reality of the vision as an article of faith, but declared the mechanics of it to be immodal, occurring in a manner completely outside the bounds of human physics or comprehension.
The Mutazilites, refusing to surrender to an immodal mystery, applied strict logic and said absolutely no.
They argued that the very definition of sight is a corporeal, physical phenomenon. It requires photons of light bouncing off a physical object and entering a biological eye.
Since God is neither a body nor an accident of light, it is a logical absurdity to claim he can be seen.
They bolstered this rational argument with scriptural evidence, prominently citing the Quranic narrative where Moses asks to physically see God on the mountain and God replies definitively, "You will not see me," before shattering the mountain to prove the physical impossibility of the encounter.
So you have the Mutazilites arguing from a stance of strict physics. You cannot visually process a non-physical entity. It breaks the laws of logic. And you have the Asherites arguing from a stance of absolute divine capability. God created the laws of logic and physics. He can easily bypass them to grant you an incomprehensible spiritual vision.
This raises an important question. This entire grueling theological gauntlet debating God's justice, his mercy, whether anyone can intercede for us, and what exactly we will experience if we make it to paradise, naturally drives us toward the final, most intensely personal question of Hermanson's entire text.
Who actually makes it through this gauntlet? Who gets saved?
Hermanson lays out a foundational epistemological concept here regarding how Islam perceives its own historical validity. It does not position itself as a radically new, unprecedented intervention in human history.
That historical self-perception is vital for understanding Islamic soteriology, the theology of salvation. Hermanson's text elucidates that Islam views itself strictly as a restoration of an ancient, universal monotheism.
The specific term used in academic theology is monotheismus, or in Islamic terms, tawhid.
The theological premise is that this pure, unadulterated message of the oneness of God was delivered perfectly to every society throughout history by thousands of prophets, including figures like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus.
However, over the centuries, human societies either unwittingly lost or deliberately altered these messages, a process of corruption known as tarif.
Therefore, the arrival of the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran wasn't introducing a novel religion to the world. It was a final corrective intervention to restore the original primordial truth.
But this broad historical view of a shared monotheism creates immense theological tension when trying to determine the strict boundaries of salvation, particularly regarding those outside the formal boundaries of historical Islam.
If God is perfectly just, how does he judge someone who never had access to this final correction.
Exactly. This was a profoundly troubling internal issue for Muslim thinkers. You have verses in the Quran stating, indeed, the religion in the sight of God is Islam.
So the rigid, exclusionary interpretation would suggest that anyone who isn't a practicing historical Muslim is automatically condemned to the fire.
But this is where Hermanson brings in the brilliant, nuanced theology of al-Ghazali.
I really want us to pause and consider how radically compassionate Ghazali's framework was, especially considering he was writing in the medieval period, an era not exactly known for its interfaith tolerance.
Ghazali recognized the fundamental conflict between a perfectly just, universally merciful God and the arbitrary geographic or historical realities that prevent people from ever hearing about Islam.
So, he developed the taxonomy of non-Muslims. He argued forcefully that those who lived virtuous, ethical lives, but who lived in distant lands, or who simply never received an accurate, undistorted presentation of Islam, could absolutely still be saved by God's overarching mercy.
Ghazali reasoned that a perfectly just God could never condemn a soul who literally never possessed a fair opportunity to comprehend the truth.
He recognized that if a person only heard a horribly distorted, propagandized version of Islam and rejected it, they weren't rejecting God's truth, they were rejecting a lie, and God would not punish them for that.
It powerfully demonstrates that the tension between a rigid, literalist reading of Scripture and the broader philosophical postulate of God's universal justice is not a modern liberal invention. It has been fiercely debated by the greatest minds in the tradition for a millennium.
Ghazali's nuanced framework perfectly illustrates the internal mechanisms of Islamic theology constantly working to balance rigorous justice with infinite mercy.
But when we move past the debate of who achieves salvation and examine the actual eschatological destinations themselves, heaven, known as Jannah, and hell, known as Jahannam, we see the interpretive spectrum fracture even further.
Hermanson notes that hell is primarily conceptualized as a place of severe, just chastisement for the wicked. However, crucially, it also functions as a temporary, painful purgatory for believers who committed major sins but died with a mustard seed of faith.
The intense heat of the fire is viewed as a necessary purification of the soul before it can enter paradise. In fact, Hermanson highlights that there were considerable debates among prominent medieval scholars regarding whether the punishment in hell would truly be eternal for anyone,
arguing that God's mercy must ultimately extinguish all suffering.
As for heaven, the literal descriptions are lush and highly sensory, portraying verdant, multi-leveled gardens, rivers of milk and honey, celestial banquets, and pure companions known as her.
But just as we saw with the punishments of the grave, the theological interpretation of these heavenly delights stretches across a vast chasm, ranging from uncompromising literalism to profound philosophical allegory.
And some of those allegorical interpretations are simply breathtaking in their psychological depth.
Hermanson highlights the thought of the famous 20th century poet-philosopher Muhammad Iqbal. Iqbal vehemently rejected the idea that heaven and hell are actual geographical localities, places on a map that you travel to after you die.
Instead, he argued that they are profound, externalized representations of your own inner character and mental states.
In Iqbal's view, hell isn't a pit of fire you are thrown into. Hell is the agonizing fire of your own corrupted nature, the painful realization of your own wasted potential.
Conversely, heaven is the profound peace and limitless expansion of a perfected, realized soul.
And then Hermanson brings Ghazali back into the fray, who delivers this incredibly sharp, almost insulting critique of the literalists who are only motivated by the physical rewards.
Ghazali essentially states that if a person's entire religious motivation is just to get to paradise, to indulge in the rivers of milk, the celestial food, and the physical delights, completely ignoring the spiritual ecstasy of meeting their creator, then their participation in heaven is no more than a beast let loose in a pasture.
They are just mindlessly consuming in a prettier location. Ghazali is demanding a massive elevation of spiritual maturity.
And beyond Iqbal and Ghazali, Hermanson explores a deeply fascinating perspective from specific Sufi thinkers regarding the very nature of those physical delights described in paradise.
The text notes that these mystics argued the scriptural emphasis on heavenly eros, the sensual, romantic, and physical delights of paradise, serves a very specific earthly purpose. It is meant to deeply valorize earthly eros.
In this view, human love, sexual intimacy, and profound physical connection in this material world are not base animalistic urges to be suppressed.
Rather, they are vital signs, tangible pointers toward the intense, unitive ecstasy of the divine reality.
Hermanson highlights this as standing in stark, deliberate contrast to certain medieval Christian ascetic views, which often regarded strict celibacy and the rejection of the body as the true anticipation of the angelic heavenly state.
In this specific Sufi eschatology, the physical and the spiritual are not at war. They are deeply, inextricably intertwined. The highest, most profound earthly experiences of love and connection are entirely valid, albeit lesser, reflections of the ultimate heavenly reality waiting at the end of the return.
It is an incredibly cohesive vision when you look at it from that altitude. Everything is intimately connected.
The physical universe reflects the spiritual reality. The end of time perfectly mirrors the beginning of time in the Primordial Covenant, and the macrocosm of the exploding universe mirrors the microcosm of the individual human soul undergoing its own death and resurrection.
It's remarkably elegant.
Okay, so we have traversed an immense amount of intellectual territory today. We've covered the categorization of theology and the creation of time. We've examined the terrifying, visceral unmaking of the cosmos, the deeply complex mechanics of the final judgment, and the grand geopolitical apocalyptic signs.
We've waded through the massive centuries-long theological debates over reason, revelation, justice, and mercy, and explored the ultimate, highly contested destinations of the human soul.
So taking a step back from all the specific doctrine, what does this all mean for us today? Using Marcia Hermanson's exhaustive text as our guide, it becomes abundantly clear that these eschatological doctrines are far more than just ancient, dusty predictions about a future date on a calendar.
They are profoundly powerful, psychologically revealing mirrors.
They reflect humanity's deepest, most enduring anxieties about chaos and our desperate need for cosmic justice. They reflect the agonizing tension of existing as a fragile, flawed creature in a universe governed by absolute power, hence the desperate theological search for a compassionate intercessor.
And above all, they reflect our unyielding longing for ultimate meaning. The hope that our lives, our sufferings, and our moral choices aren't just random, fleeting accidents in a cold universe, but are vital, indelible parts of a grand return to a divine source.
I would add that the ultimate tenor of Islamic eschatology, as Hermanson's analysis concludes, is undeniably one of profound optimism.
Despite the terrifying imagery of the apocalypse, the overarching narrative stresses the absolute, inexorable triumph of good over evil.
The historical victory of the Asherite perspective in many of these theological battles cemented a worldview where God's ultimate desire is to forgive by gairi hisab, entirely without reckoning or mathematical limitation.
That mercy sits at the very heart of reality. Whether you choose to view these eschatological events literally as physical realities that will one day shatter the atomic structure of our universe, or allegorically as necessary stages of profound internal soul-making and psychological realization, they serve an identical, vital purpose.
They aggressively remind us that our actions in this material world possess immense eternal weight.
They remind us that the flow of human history is not an arbitrary, meaningless sequence of events. It possesses a determined moral arc, a specific destination, and it culminates in a final, absolute vindication of justice, beauty, and mercy.
And that profound sense of weight and purpose brings us to the end of our analytical journey through this text. But before we go, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over on your own time.
Hermanson's text demonstrated how the original eschatological symbols of the past, the terrifying imagery of falling stars, oceans boiling over, the sudden worthlessness of pregnant camels, the weighing of invisible deeds on massive literal scales, were specifically calibrated to completely subvert the comforting, everyday conventions of the pre-Islamic Arabs.
They were meticulously designed to shock those specific people into recognizing the extreme, terrifying fragility of their material reality.
So my question to you is this.
If the signs of the hour were being revealed today, written specifically to shatter the complacency of our modern, hyper-connected, technologically insulated world, what would those signs look like?
What are the unquestionable permanent constants of your daily life that would need to be violently, suddenly overturned to wake you up to the reality of your own soul?
What is the unquestionably real illusion in your world that you need to snap out of before the trumpet blows?
It is a profoundly unsettling yet necessary question to carry with you as you navigate the fragility of our present moment.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We highly encourage you to go find Marcia Hermanson's work and keep digging into these original sources yourself. The complexity of the tradition is staggering, and there's always more to learn. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning the architecture of the world around you, and take care.